Hi, everyone. This is Representative David Welter here, joined with Representative Mike Marron. Thank you for tuning in to our virtual town hall. We'll be getting started here in just a minute. If you do have any questions, feel free to use the chat feature here on the Zoom, and we will get to your questions. So again, we're going to wait just a minute here as folks are joining for our virtual town hall today with myself, Representative David Welter, and Representative Mike Marron. Again, if you do have any questions, feel free to use the chat feature on the bottom right of your screen to ask any questions, and we will do our best to get to all questions that come through the queue. You have joined us today for a virtual town hall with myself, Representative David Welter, and Representative Mike Marron. We'll give it about another 20-30 seconds and we will start the program. All right, we are going to start today's virtual town hall. I just wanted to again reiterate, my name is David Welter and I am the state representative for the 75th district. Joined with me today is Representative Mike Marron, and we are putting on a virtual town hall within our districts here for constituents to ask questions of us. We will do some interactive polling as well to get your temperature and take on different issues affecting the state. To start, I kind of wanted to give a little bit of a legislative update in this pandemic COVID year. The General Assembly, just for your reference, we typically meet from the start of January until May 31st. By May 31st, constitutionally, we're supposed to pass the fiscal budget for the state of Illinois. This year with COVID, just as we had with last year, we've had a more limited session. We did go down in January for swearing in for the new 102nd General Assembly that took office and passed the House rules. Since then, we've only been down one other time, which was last week. To briefly conduct some business, but we had also passed rules that allowed us to legislate remotely. With that being said, this week in Springfield is committee deadline for the House. What that means is any bills that I proposed or Representative Marron has proposed that are in committee, this is our week to really get those before committee, discuss them, and pass them out of committee. If you do not pass your bill out of committee by deadline, which is this Friday, it most likely won't get an opportunity to be called. So this is really our busy week. And not being down in Springfield makes it a little more difficult to conduct business. This is all new to us in this virtual world. Yesterday, I was here in my district office from 8 a.m. until about 8:30 p.m., involved in multiple committee meetings. I wanted to start off today's town hall to talk specifically about an issue that is very important to myself and also the constituents within my area, but really constituents throughout the entire state of Illinois. I have the distinct honor, besides being in leadership and being the House Republican Conference Chair, I also serve as the Republican Minority Spokesperson on the Energy and Environment Committee in the House. So anything that involves environment, energy comes before the Oversight Committee, in which I have leadership on. One of the big issues for folks here at home is future energy policy in Illinois, specifically our nuclear fleet. Right now in Morris, my hometown here, Dresden is on the chopping block in terms of headed for an early closure, along with Byron, which is up in Dixon, Illinois. I have the distinct honor of representing half of Illinois' nuclear fleet. So within the 75th district, we have the LaSalle Station, Dresden Station, and Braidwood Station. As many people on this call, I'm sure, are aware, nuclear power is a huge asset to Illinois. It powers millions of homes in Illinois. And the thought that we may see some of our assets come offline early due to changes that have been made in our regulatory scheme is concerning to myself. People say, you know, if you do something for nuclear, it's going to cost funds to do that. It's going to cost ratepayers money to do that. I'd remind people that the cost of doing nothing is greater than the cost of us doing something. So we've been working with stakeholders, the governor's office, labor, to try to hammer out a deal that will keep our nuclear power plants open. We'll invest in solar energy, invest in electric vehicle infrastructure, and really move Illinois to be a leader in the nation in terms of energy policy. There's not a lot of great things when we are trying to attract businesses and even residents to our state. It is sad to see that Illinois marks so low on several of the metrics that people would look at. What I would say is, since deregulation in the 90s in Illinois, energy is one of our greatest assets. We actually have a fairly low cost of energy compared to a lot of our neighbors, and does give us somewhat of a competitive edge. So that's something I've been advocating for a lot this session. Another issue that I've been working on is domestic violence. There is a constituent in my district, Cassandra Tanner Miller, who about over a year ago, her estranged husband broke into her house, unfortunately murdered their young son, attempted to take her life and her daughter's life before he turned the gun on himself and took his own life. The unfortunate circumstances with that, aside from losing a life, was the multiple levels of government, the court systems, and the statutes that we have in place today that unfortunately failed not just Cassandra, but other victims across the state who are no longer able to speak up about domestic violence because they've lost their life at the hands of their abuser. So I've been spending the last year really digging in deep into our domestic violence laws and wraparound services to find how we can best help care for those who have been affected by domestic violence. I have a lot of other priorities and bills in which I am working on that would benefit our area and our state. We continue as the Republican caucus to push for a plan we introduced a few weeks ago called Reimagine Illinois. Reimagine Illinois, you know, a government that has strong ethics laws, that has fair maps, that supports our police, and an Illinois that encourages business development in our state through limited taxation and really not putting the burden on property tax payers to fund a lot of our government services. So we're continuing to talk about those, hold press conferences on those, and communicate to the public about the alternative plan. You know, so often I feel like we're criticized as the party of no. That can't be said today in Illinois, as we have laid out several policy proposals that would help put Illinois on the right track to fiscal solvency and to address a lot of the concerns of many of our constituents. So those are a few things that I'm working on right now and priorities that I think are very important. But I would like to turn it over to Representative Mike Marron to talk about what he's been working on.
Thank you, Representative Welter. Thank you to everybody who is in attendance today. I would like to remind you that if you have a question, to hit the Q&A button or the chat button and submit your question. We'll be reminding you of that several times. So please, we're going to try to get to as many questions as we can. I would really like to thank Representative Welter for joining me here today. Representative Welter is truly one of the good guys in Springfield. He's level-headed and, works with everybody to try to find solutions to problems. And he's now a part of our caucus leadership team, which is very well deserved. He's somebody that I've known for a long time. We both participated in the Edgar Fellows program together. We both came from county government, former county board chair. So he's somebody that I think a lot of and value his opinion greatly. As we, sift through the madness that can be Springfield from time to time. So, I guess, he covered a lot of the highlights of what's going on in the legislative session. I would say that this is a very unique session, just because, generally, especially the first session right after an election, it's pretty intense, and we're there, pretty much from the 1st of January to the 1st of June in Springfield. And this, of course, has been very different. But I will say, January, February was kind of slow. Typically March is the month where we do a lot of our committee work, even under normal circumstances. But, the virtual committee phenomenon that we're doing everything by Zoom now, it can be convenient. And, certainly it's a tool that I think even when the pandemic ends, we'll probably be utilizing that more and more. You would think that making it more convenient may make it a little less intense, but I don't think that's been the case. I think it's allowed, because we're meeting virtually, to cram a lot more things in, which can be a good thing, but it can be a bad thing too. There's been 4,000 pieces of legislation filed in the House. And so for those 4,000 pieces of legislation, it runs the gamut of ideas. You have very good ideas and you have very bad ideas and everything in between. And so, it's just a very, very intense, laborious process to try to go through 4,000 pieces of legislation and try to figure out which ones are good, which ones are bad. And then, getting a handle on what's going to come up in front of the committee. So I would say the virtual process has made it easier, maybe in some respects, to get good pieces of legislation called, but it's also made it easier to get bad pieces of legislation called. So, we're in a unique situation where we have the ability to get some of our ideas across in a little more efficient way, but we also have to play defense on a lot of the nonsense that's out there. The other thing that's a little troublesome about the virtual process that I find, Representative Welter, I think, mentioned, is our Republican spokesperson on the Energy and Environment Committee, which I serve on as well. And that's a pretty intense, there's a lot of significant legislation that comes through that committee. And so a week ago, yesterday, the Clean Energy Jobs Act passed through that committee. And I think everybody is aware that we're going to address energy policy at some point in this session. And rightfully so, there's things need addressed. And I think you would be foolish to think that we are not going to make some significant changes. I think that's the political reality of where we're at. You're going to see a greater push and more pressure for clean, renewable energy. That's just the reality of where we're at. But I think one thing that kind of left me a little unsettled is the fact that that piece of legislation passed through a virtual committee where there is definitely a limited access to the public, more so than what the normal process would be. And so you have a major piece of legislation, and certainly I don't think that will be the final product that we vote on and that becomes law. There will be significant changes to it. But, you have a major piece of legislation that could potentially pretty well radically change the way things are done with our energy policy, that's voted on, debated, discussed in a virtual setting where the access for the general public is very limited. And just from a transparency standpoint, that makes me very nervous. I don't think that's a very good way to do business. I understand the realities of where we're at with COVID, et cetera, but I think that we have to to try to make exceptions and engage the public as much as we possibly can, because that's the only good way to do business, as far as I'm concerned, when you're dealing with major changes like that. I would keep your eyes and ears open out in the public, to what the final product is going to be as we get into the spring session. I think that will be something that gets voted on by the time we're finished at the end of May. I think, of course, the other big thing, there's a couple big things out there. The fiscal situation in the state of Illinois, that always seems to be the number one issue, and rightfully so, because the state's in such poor fiscal health. Of course, it now, after a year of a COVID shutdown, it's even more critical. We're kind of at a crisis level. The governor, over a month ago, released his budget plan, which I had a lot of concerns with. I think he backtracked on a lot of promises he made, especially to our caucus. He's talked about some tax increases, some revoking some tax credits, things like that, in order to quote unquote balance the budget, and really is trying to shuffle some money around and do things that are not very transparent. That was his plan. Of course, that remains to be seen and worked out in the General Assembly through the budget process. So, I don't think the governor is going to get everything that he wants. And of course, the other thing that's happened since his budget address is that Washington, D.C. has came in with their COVID relief bill, which, as near as we can tell, is going to bring about, I think, like $7.5 billion into the state. Of course, the rules are still being written on that in the federal government, so it remains to be seen how those dollars can be allocated. And I think that there's going to be a very vigorous debate on that issue as we get into the spring session and the budget talks, on how those dollars are allocated. In my personal opinion, we need to go and take care of our current responsibilities, take care of our unpaid bills, and make sure that we shore up our fiscal situation before we take on any more liability. And unfortunately, as we go through this committee process, every day we see bills presented by the majority party that increase spending. And so that's something that always concerns me, because we really need to take whatever federal relief we get and apply that to our current obligations and get our fiscal house in order before we decide that we want to spend any more money. And so I think that you're going to see a pretty strong debate on that as we get towards the end of session. And I've got a lot of heartburn about the federal bailout. On one hand, I guess I'm conflicted. On one hand, I think the reality of where we're at without the federal money is that you're going to see money dry up to local school districts, local governments, people that depend on state money. And so certainly nobody wants to see that. That would cause a lot of problems on the local level. But the thing that makes me real nervous is by Washington, D.C. stepping in and just basically giving us this money to bail us out. I'm afraid that we're going to refuse to learn our lesson, because that's what we've done in the past. I think the other big thing, and there's a lot of unanswered questions with this as we go through session, this is the year where we redraw the legislative districts. And of course, that is dependent on the census data, which is delayed this year. So it throws the whole timeline for the remap off. And so that process is going to be challenging, as we all are going to probably have new districts coming up in 2022. And, I think that this is just a very valid time to call on the governor to support a fair map process. I think that's long overdue. I think there's bipartisan support for that. I think everybody in the public pretty much supports that. And, I think it's time for that process to be implemented. So I think with that, that pretty much sums up my update. We'll go to questions here. Remind everybody, use the chat feature or the Q&A feature. Another thing I want to mention real quick, we're going to launch a couple poll questions. So I think our staff is going to launch the first set of questions right now. The first question is, do you think it's time to bring all of our K through 12 students back into the classroom? That would be the first question. And then number two, do you think we should allow spectators at all our elementary and high school sporting events? So we definitely want your feedback on that, and you will have the ability to answer that poll question. So I think with that, we're ready to go to questions.
Yeah, I do see that we have recently put up the back to school question. And as we have those questions roll in, I can speak specifically to our area before we get into questions. And I know I worked very closely with the governor's administration to ensure that we got our allocation of vaccines in our area. I know from educators, and rightfully so, they wanted to make sure they were vaccinated before we went back full time. And I'm pretty proud to say, at least in our region, any educator that wished to be vaccinated at this point has been vaccinated. And that was a combined effort. So understanding that folks in our area are vaccinated, do you believe it's time to get back to school full time? And I think what you'll find is a lot of our schools have now transitioned back to full time, or at least have some hybrid model in place.
I would add, I think that's similar. I represent a lot of rural school districts that have been back in some capacity for quite some time. And then some of the more urban schools are transitioning back as well currently. But I think, you know, I get a lot of calls from people that are ready for that process to, I think largely the sentiment is for the kids to be back at school.
So it looks like we're sharing the poll results now. For that first question, do you think it's time to bring K through 12 students back in the classroom? We had 79% of the respondents with yes, 17% with no, and 4% undecided. For that second question, do you think we should allow spectators at elementary and high school sporting events? 83% yes, 8% no, and 8% undecided. The guidance that came out recently from the governor's administration talked about a 25% capacity at sporting events, just as an FYI to folks as well. That is the current regulations that we are living under. And one other point that I wanted to do, if I could, prior to us taking questions is, I understand that the governor was in a tough position when the pandemic struck. You saw Democrat and Republican governors throughout this country putting in executive orders and doing it because of the public health and safety. The problem that I think that we have as representatives, Mike and I, is that some of these decisions that were made, I don't necessarily oppose. Some of them I definitely do, but there really hasn't been checks and balances the way it should be. So in government, you know, you've got the executive branch, judicial branch, and the legislative branch. For this last year, almost entirely, the state has been run on governor's executive orders and then court decisions, and the legislature has basically been MIA in doing our job. That's not because Representative Marron and I don't want to. It's because of the really, you know, health concerns and safety concerns from the majority party have not wanted us to go down and conduct business. So although we did talk about now being able to do some remote work, it's not the same as really being there. It is hard to bring witnesses before committee and get the questions answered that you need. So that has been frustrating, that the legislature has really not been able to do our fiduciary duty of oversight for the state in the way in which we have in the past. But Mike, I figure we could open up for questions now.
Yep, sounds good.
Okay, representatives, we have a question that came in. The Illinois House Republican staff recently launched the Reimagine Illinois platform. In this proposal, there are issues to reform the gun laws. As an avid Second Amendment defender and supporter, what are these reforms, and are there anything going on in the legislator right now that might impede these gun laws?
Well, I guess I'll jump in at first. The only proposals I know on our side regarding, I think there's been several proposals on our side to, first of all, abolish the FOID card, which I'm a co-sponsor on, and I feel very strongly about that. I am an avid supporter of the Second Amendment, and I think the FOID card system doesn't make a lot of sense. I think it's broken. A majority of the calls that I get in my office these days, now that the IDES situation is somewhat better, is people that can't access their FOID cards. So I would like to see the FOID card go away. In lieu of that, I think there's other legislation out there, some of it that I've co-sponsored as well, that if we are not able to do away with the FOID card, that we're able to streamline the process and actually make it work so that we don't see these ridiculous delays that we have. But I think, in large, the Republican caucus is very pro Second Amendment. And you're not going to see any kind of reforms from our caucus that's going to impede the Second Amendment. I don't think that there would be very few people in our caucus that would get behind any kind of gun control measures.
Yeah, and I would say
to
to add to that, Mike, you're absolutely right there, and that there are members of our caucus who do support doing away with the FOID card. Mike and I might have a little bit of a different opinion on that, in the sense that I have not supported that legislation to do with the FOID card. However, I have supported legislation that would require the state to issue the FOID cards in a more timely manner, provide adequate funding at the state police to make sure that they are doing that. But when it comes to our position, we are trying to make it easier for law-abiding citizens to be able to exercise their Second Amendment right. You won't see any bills from Republicans to actually try to restrict that right any further than they already are in Illinois. We want to make it easier for, again, law-abiding citizens to be able to exercise that right.
Okay, has there been any discussions about pension reform?
I can take a crack at that. There have been discussions. The House Republicans continue to say that we are open to a dialogue about pension reform. Unfortunately, with the numbers in the Illinois House and the fact that the Republicans are in the super minority right now, I can tell you from my personal standpoint, I've always been one to say that the promises that have been made to pensioners in Illinois need to be honored. With that being said, there are things that we can do moving forward to help limit some of our liabilities. A huge cost driver of pensions in Illinois is that guaranteed compounding COLA every single year. After a certain amount of years, a retiree is making more money retired than they were when they were working. And that has really continued to drive up the cost of pensions in Illinois. You can't talk about reforming Illinois without including pensions as part of that discussion. I would want to make sure, because when you look at the overall data and those pensioners, something that I guess sometimes frustrates me about our party at times is that we kind of put all of those folks in the same bucket, and sometimes pensioners get vilified. You know, these are good folks in our community who have dedicated their life to certain services and have worked very hard for their pensions. So we want to make sure we protect those, but we also want to make sure that we control the expense of pensions moving forward. And that has to be part of that discussion.
I would say I definitely want to second what Representative Welter said about honoring the promises that we made. You know, that is so critically important, because people have made significant life decisions on promises that were made, and you know, you're only as good as your word, and so we need to follow through on that. You know, I think one of my frustrations and also one of my fears, because the fiscal situation is so dire right now after the economy's been shut down for a year, I worry how that's going to affect the pension situation. You go back to 2 years ago, 2019, was my first session in the General Assembly, and the economy was roaring. And in April hits, and the economy was so good that we got an influx of money into the Treasury that nobody was expecting. And in fact, up until that time, we had gone with the assumption that we were going to have to make some pretty significant cuts in state government to try to balance the budget. And there were some bipartisan discussions about where cuts could be made, et cetera. And I think at the time they came up with a pretty good plan that, you know, both sides could kind of live with. And then all this money comes into the Treasury unexpectedly, or we thought it was going to, because the economy was so good. And so what happens? They toss all the cuts and everything that they talked about out the window for, you know, the whole budget process, and they passed the largest budget in the history of the state, and they spent all the extra money that was coming in. And then COVID hits, and then all of a sudden all that money didn't come in. And so we were behind the 8 ball. You know, I really think what we needed to do was we needed to really cut back. And, you know, the pension payment's like a out of control credit card payment in a household, right? I mean, you're getting maxed out on interest and penalties every month. And if you skip a payment, it gets worse. And so the only way to get on top of that is to put more money towards it, get that money working for you, get the compound interest down, and then your payment lowers, and it becomes less and less of a burden on your budget. And that's the only way we're going to ever get in front of the pension problem, which, you know, there was a great opportunity a couple of years ago to get that done, but sadly that wasn't, you know, that wasn't utilized. And so now we're really in a fix. And I really hope that as we go through these budget discussions, that somebody doesn't float the idea of skipping another pension payment, because that's how we got into this very bad situation. And I worry that because of the fiscal constraints that we have right now, that could possibly come up again, which will only make the problem worse as we go forward.
Okay, we have a question about the Illinois Department of Employment Security, looking for an update. Representative Marron, you want to take that one?
Sure. So, you know, the situation with IDES, it's something that I've been very passionate about, and it's kind of evolved. You know, I think a year ago, right when the economy gets shut down, I think we had a very, I think most of our calls were people that were having trouble just accessing the system, trying to get, you know, just regular unemployment claims. And so then it evolved into the fraud issue. And then the thing that really touched me off, it was around the holidays, right before Christmas, was when people started getting these PUA repayment demands. So that has changed somewhat. The thing that we're seeing now with IDES is that so the federal government allowed for the repayment of the PUA overpayment to be waived. The problem is that it's a cumbersome process that the state of Illinois makes you do if you're a business owner that applied for PUA and for some reason you were overpaid and now they're demanding that you repay it. It's a very cumbersome process to appeal that. And people are having a hard time getting a hold of anybody at the department, which has been the story for the last year on every subject that's come through our office. It's just been very difficult to get a hold of anybody at IDES. And so now you're getting very frustrated people who think that they have a legitimate appeal to have their PUA repayment waived, that can't get a hold of anybody at the department. So that's frustrating. We're trying to come up with a good way to actually assist people as they apply for those waivers, because a lot of these people have spent this PUA money already, and it's gone. They spent it just trying to survive while their businesses were shut down. And so I will say that IDES, and I don't know if it's because the call volume's down, they have been more responsive. You know, I don't want to just be overly critical all the time. I beat up on them pretty bad in the last year, and rightfully so. I think they had it coming. Here as of late, they've done much better at responding to people, at least responding to us when we've asked for them to help people, when we've asked people on their behalf. So, I'm going to keep pushing for this. I still think that we need to have legislative hearings on this to find out what happened. Another thing that I will say is very frustrating through this whole thing, and IDES is just a part of this. We see this with the state police when it comes to FOID cards. We see this with people trying to renew license plates sometimes. I had a problem with the House Fiscal Office recently, and it seems like every single agency in government right now is working from home. They're not there. Look, I understand it's a pandemic. I understand that it's dangerous. I understand that we got to take precautions, but this is a time when you need government to function. More so than any other time, you need government to be there and to function and to be a resource for people when things are at their worst. And I get that we've got to protect our employees and stuff, but when you work for the government, you have to assume some of that risk. That's my problem with the fact that we haven't been meeting as a General Assembly is, yes, maybe it's dangerous, but we get paid a good salary. That's part of what we signed up for. We signed up to be leaders, and that's why we should be there in Springfield, just like it's a normal year, being there, making sure government functions. And we really need answers from the governor why state government has failed to operate on a basic level. And IDES is the #1 department that owes everybody a big explanation for what's happened in the last year.
And Representative Marron and our guests on the call today appreciate it so much that you've tuned in. Representative Marron is going to be on here to continue to answer questions. We're also going to put the contact information to my office. If you'd like to individually follow up with me, I'm happy to talk to you over the phone, email, or even in person, taking precautions. But I do have to jump off. I'm the spokesperson today for Judicial Civil Committee, where we have some important legislation that needs to move. So I'm going to be jumping off that to go and lead that committee. So Mike, thanks for everything that you're doing. And good luck with the rest of the virtual town hall.
Thanks, David.
All right, Representative Marron, we have a question about the new House Speaker and how things are going to be a little bit different now that the longtime Speaker Madigan is no longer with.
Sure. Just my impressions, I guess, on the new House Speaker.
Yeah, we had a question, just wondering if there's going to be a change in the bipartisan spirit, or if anything that you've seen that just came in right on the chat.
Gotcha. So I guess my impressions are mixed at this point. Obviously, I think anytime that it was long past time for Speaker Madigan to go. Anytime you've been in a position for 40 years, it's time for some new leadership. So that in and of itself is a positive thing. The other positive thing I'll say is that when we voted on the rules, there's a lot that leaves that the rules of the House, there's a lot of that leaves to be desired with the rules. A lot of it is the same old stuff, but they at least talked about implementing term limits for the leadership. And so that was a positive development. I think some of the concerns with the House rules and how we operate, it still leaves the speaker kind of the one person that has the final say so in what legislation gets called. So under Speaker Madigan, there's 118 members of the House, including the Speaker. If 117 members wanted to pass something, say legislative leadership term limits or fair map redistricting, but the one person, the Speaker, did not want that, the Speaker could stop the other 117 members from getting that piece of legislation called. And so I will say that very little has changed in that regard. The Speaker still has the final authority on what gets called. We're kind of operating in a different environment now, virtually. And so I get the sense that things are a little maybe disorganized a little more than what they normally have been. Certainly anybody that steps into that position is going to have a learning curve, especially when the guy that held the office prior to this held it for 40 years. And he was a well-known micromanager that, he didn't delegate responsibility to people very much. So I think it's expected that there's a learning curve, but I do see signs that things are maybe not as organized as what they were, which from a political standpoint, I think that offers our caucus some opportunity. And I think, one thing that I see is I think you're going to see, which this scares me in a sense. It scares me a lot, actually, that I think the new speaker is a little more progressive than the former speaker. And so a lot of the legislation that's moving is not good stuff. But I think that was kind of to be expected. And once again, I think it creates an opportunity for our caucus to step in and be the more reasonable of the two caucuses if we can develop good plans like the Reimagine Illinois plan, where we can actually show people what we stand for and how we'll change things and make things better. But we're going to have a big fight on our hands playing defense, keeping a lot of these bad policies away, because I do think the new speaker is probably to the left of the old speaker.
Okay, we have a few people that were asking about energy policy, especially with the rise in bills about alternative energy. And they're wondering what your thoughts are, moving forward. How do we best, create a modern infrastructure and manufacturing, and some of our older stuff in central and southern Illinois energy policy with the new age stuff?
That's a great question. And so I think, my perspective on energy policy, I think I am somebody that's supportive of all energy. I think that we can get I think the more energy that we can have access to, the better. And so I'm certainly not opposed to renewable forms of energy. And I think that you're going to see more and more pressure more and more pressure to move towards renewables. And I think that's the reality of where we're at. I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. The thing that makes me nervous, and the thing that made me nervous about the bill that passed in committee, the Clean Energy Jobs Act last week, was the fact that you've got two service how do I explain it? There's two networks that provide power in the state of Illinois. You've got the Chicago area, which is called the PJM, and then the rest of the state, which is the MISO area. And so the MISO area their power is generally generated by fossil fuels, coal plants, natural gas, etc. And the Chicago area is a lot of it's nuclear and some renewables, things like that. So the current bill that passed would subsidize a lot of the Chicago area energy at the expense of the fossil fuels, which of course is not good for our area of the state because it could potentially drive up prices pretty significantly. And I'm also worried that it would lead to a lot of our energy suppliers downstate going out of business. And so, I think we're going to see a transition into more renewables. That's the reality. But certainly, I think I'm pro solar. I think solar makes sense, especially on individual households. But I just don't want to do anything that's going to add an extra burden, especially to our ratepayers and their households, but especially to large employers, manufacturers in cities like Danville or Rantoul that need those good high-paying jobs. And so, I want to be part of the energy policy discussions as they go forward because I'm an open-minded person. But I really think that we need to beef up all of our energy supplies, renewables, nuclear, and the traditional types, because I think having a reliable, cheap energy supply is critical to economic development.
Okay, we have a question. I know you talked about this a little bit earlier, Representative, but it's on fair maps. And someone is just would like to know what the House Republicans are going to be doing about the fair map process, and maybe a little bit about how the census is going to be affecting that process this year.
So to start out with the second part of the question, so we are constitutionally mandated by the Illinois Constitution to have the maps redrawn, I believe the deadline's by June 30th. And if that is not done, then it goes to an independent commission. The problem is, of course, that we use the census data to redraw the maps because you want, in the House, it's 118 identically populated districts and 59 in the Senate. And so we need that census data to make sure that the population, the districts are drawn appropriately to cover the population. And of course, we now know that the census data is probably going to be delayed until September, which causes a real problem because to be honest with you, I don't know how we're going to meet our constitutional deadline to draw the map because we don't have the information. And so, probably this is going to get sorted out in the court system, unfortunately. Nobody wants to hear that because anytime the court system gets involved, it's a messy process. But I don't know that we've ever been into this situation before. And, we're going to have to kind of figure it out. And a lot of this will probably get answered in the court system. So that's what really is going to throw a wrench into the remap process with the census data. Overwhelmingly, the House Republican caucus for a number of years has supported legislative initiatives to create a fair map process. At various times, we've been involved through private organizations at getting a constitutional amendment on the ballot, asking for a fair map process. So, right now, obviously, it's up to the majority party whether any kind of legislative initiative like that moves. So right now, I think the best thing we can do is continue to call on the majority in the General Assembly to pass a constitutional amendment mandating fair maps and continue to call on the Governor Pritzker, campaigned on supporting fair maps. And so now, it's time for him to deliver on his promise. And I think the best thing that we can do is to continue to call for that. We can propose legislation. We have proposed legislation, but it's up to the majority party to actually make that happen. And so, one thing that I hope, I guess I'm the eternal optimist. I hope the new speaker is maybe more open to it than the former speaker, because I do think it's bipartisan. And I think there's a lot of people on both sides of the aisle. I think there's a lot of my Democratic colleagues that would support a fair map process. And so it's time for the legislative leaders to step up. It's time for the governor to put his money where his mouth is.
All right, Representative, should we do our second poll?
Yeah, we've got one more poll question, and we'll probably go for another 10 minutes or so. Then this will have gone on for an hour, so try to get to a few more questions. But in the meantime, on a scale of 1 to 5, with 5 being the most ready and 1 being not ready, are you prepared and willing to have our economy completely reopened? While you're filling out that poll question, we can go on to another question.
We have another question here for you, Representative, about Governor Pritzker and his failed fair tax. One of our attendees would like to know if you've been noticing any other bills that is going on that is trying to circumvent the will of the people, trying to provide more taxes or anything that's going to make us in a fiscally unsound position further.
Well, I think as far as making things fiscally unsound, the number one thing that we have to watch out for, I said this earlier, I sit in these committee meetings every week, and the majority party continues to pass legislation that mandates more spending. And so the last thing we need to be doing right now is spending more money on anything until we get things fixed. So that's the number one problem with things that are going to create havoc fiscally is we've got to stop spending money. Yeah, the governor has done several things. Back in January, when we came in for lame duck session, he tried to decouple us from the federal tax system. In the CARES Act at the end of March last year, the federal government, in a bipartisan way, Donald Trump and Nancy Pelosi agreed on this, agreed to basically allow you, if you claimed a loss in 2020 because the economy was so bad, you could go back and amend any tax return for the previous 5 years and claim your 2020 loss in any of those tax years. So it would actually allow for a tax refund and potentially, which is a quasi stimulus payment, right? It was a tax break for small businesses who were hurt by the pandemic. So what the governor proposed to do was to sever us from the federal tax code so that Illinois would basically take that tax relief that the federal government provided away from small businesses that had been devastated. And I was shocked and mad. This was the exact same time that all my constituents were getting these crazy PUA repayment letters demanding IDS. It was demanding that they pay back thousands and thousands of dollars of federal relief that was given to them. And so we pushed back hard on that. We actually got that defeated in the lame duck session. I've heard rumors that that's gonna come back, but we're pretty well into the tax process. April 15th is coming up pretty quick, so we're getting close to the end of filing for the 2020 tax year. So I think it would be horrible for the governor to try to do that again. A lot of people filed their income taxes already. So that's one thing. The governor's budget address was made up of closing tax breaks. He calls them corporate loopholes, but they're tax incentives, tax breaks that a lot of them he agreed to in the budget process 2 years ago. They were promises he made to our caucus in order to get some of us to vote on things that were not necessarily things that we wanted to vote on, but we thought that it was positive for business owners and for the economy to get those tax breaks. And so now he's threatening to pull the rug out from underneath of us, which is just unconscionable. You got things like that, things like the biodiesel, excuse me, I've been talking too long, the biodiesel tax credit that helps out farmers, who sell soybeans for biodiesel. He wants to eliminate things like that. Right now, we need to be looking at ways to try to get more relief to our businesses that have been devastated by the governor's shutdown, not taking away tax incentives that could potentially help them stay afloat. And so you're going to see a lot more pressure in that regard as we get closer and get through the budget discussions, I believe. And I will be pushing back hard on those ideas. Looks like we have the poll results. So 69% of you answered 5. You are completely ready to have the economy open. It looks like 13% of you answered 4, 13% of you answered 3. Nobody answered 2, and only 6% answered 1. So to varying degrees, I think people are ready to have the economy completely opened, it looks like. So I appreciate your participation in both of those poll questions. So that's valuable information that we have when we're making decisions. So looks like we've got a lot more questions. We'll try to get back to you if you leave your contact information, we'll try to get back to you on these questions. But in the meantime, we got time for a couple more, another 5 minutes or so, if you guys want to give me a couple more questions.
All right, Representative Marron. Yeah, we answered most of those in the chat already. We have another question here on what is your top priority or priorities for Central Illinois during this session?
Well, so I appreciate that question very much. So I think the number one priority is to try to get relief to small business owners that have been hurt, and try to do anything that we can to help create some economic growth in the areas that I represent. You know, I represent a lot of great communities, but a lot of my communities have been very economically challenged prior to the pandemic, and they've been very, very hurt by the pandemic. And so, yeah, any kind of relief, any kind of initiative that we can do to help grow the economy and get jobs, that's obviously number one. My focus as we get into these budget discussions, my focus from the get-go when I ran the first time has been transportation and education. And so, you know, definitely want to get transportation projects, keep them going, get stretches of road like the stretch of I-74 outside of Tilton to the Indiana state line, which could possibly be the worst stretch of road in the entire state. You know, get projects like that done in the area. That'll help with the economic development too. And just as we get into these budget discussions, protect our education funding. And then finally, I know that's more than number one priority. I've given you about three, and here's the fourth one. You know, I just want to keep holding government accountable, because like I said earlier, I think the way that, you know, whether it's IDES or whether, you know, it's the FOID card system, we've seen a real failure in the way government's operated in the past year and even before that. And, you know, that needs to stop, regardless of whether you're a conservative or you're a liberal or a Republican or a Democrat. You want the government services to function and be there when you need them, and that needs to happen.
We have a final question for you, Representative Marron. We have a couple people ask about agriculture. Is there an update that you'd want to give on how COVID has kind of affected the farmers of our state?
Well, you know, I guess I'm in a pretty good spot to answer this because I am a farmer. That's my day job. So, you know, I think all in all, we've come through it pretty good. I mean, it's been a challenging time for everybody. And certainly a year ago, you know, you saw a lot of market disruptions, especially when, you know, there for a while, a lot of the meat plants, the pork plants were shutting down, and that caused a huge disruption in the grain markets because, you know, livestock's our number one customer. You know, that's settled out, you know, to this point. In fact, you know, markets are a lot better than what they were a year ago. So that's a positive. But, you know, we struggle like everybody else does with dealing with COVID and you know, having our local schools open, et cetera. You know, I think probably the one thing that makes me afraid the most for agriculture probably is the fallout, the fiscal impact to the state. Because you know, you're going to see an impact in agriculture on several levels. First of all, if funding to local governments and local school district dries up, you're going to see an increase in property taxes, which were already not competitive with our neighbors in property taxes. And who pays property taxes? Farmers pay a huge portion of the property tax burden in our state. So, you know, that's a potential fallout from COVID that could really impact farmers, higher property taxes. And then, you know, I mentioned the biodiesel tax credit, which if that goes away, that could, you know, hurt our use of domestic soybeans and animal fat for a really good market. So, you're going to see changes in policy that could hurt us like that. One idea that was floated early on that is a horrible idea. I will scream and yell and push back against this every chance I get. You always see the Chicago legislators wanting to do away with the sales tax exemption on ag inputs, which is insane because there would no longer be any ag inputs bought in the state of Illinois if that were to go away. We'd just go get our farm supplies from Indiana or Missouri or Iowa or wherever, because none of our neighbors have sales tax on their farm inputs. And so luckily, I think, since the fiscal situation doesn't look quite as bad as it did earlier, and the federal government's bailed us out, that idea hasn't surfaced like we thought it was going to early on. But I think those are the real challenges that we potentially see in agriculture. Maybe some pretty dramatic policy changes that could really hurt us on down the line. And so I will always be on the watch for those for sure.
Okay, well, if you want to wrap it up here, Representative.
Yeah, absolutely. I really appreciate everybody getting on today. Thanks again to Leader Welter, who had to leave a little bit early. Hopefully we answered most of your questions. If not, you can always reach out to me. My email address is mike@repmikemarron.com. You can contact my office, 217-477-0104. I always try to answer everybody that I can who gets a hold of me on Facebook Messenger too. So, you can reach out to me, like my Facebook page, shoot me a message over Facebook Messenger. If you're able to get a message to me, we'll do our best to respond. So appreciate everybody's involvement. Thanks for everything, and have a great day. And don't hesitate to get a hold of me if I can help you out with anything.